Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 240. Today, we're going to be looking at theories of the good life. So we're just going to spend one session looking at two different theories. I'm going to record two separate videos just to give you a little break in between. But let's get underway. Oh, I see a little typo there. I'm going to fix it up. Okay, yeah, let's get underway. So, we are thinking about theories of the good life today. So, this is a question about what is it for you to be doing well? What's the difference between flourishing and not flourishing, being happy and not being happy? That's the kind of question we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to start by thinking about the theory of the good life called hedonism, which basically says that a good life is a life that's full of pleasure. We're going to look at some of its benefits and drawbacks. And then in the second video, we're going to look at desire satisfaction theory. And again, we're going to look at what the theory says and what some of its benefits and drawbacks are. And we'll also be, especially in the desire satisfaction theory video, also thinking more broadly about what we would call objective theories of well-being. So let's get to it. A theory of well-being is an attempt at stating what it is for a life to go well and what kind of things make a life go better. So it's trying to give a theoretical account of what makes the difference between a life well-lived and a life not so well-lived. Now, Shafer-Landau says in the text that if you want to live a good life, you'd better get the right theory of it. I think that that might be overstating the case somewhat, right? There are a lot of people who live perfectly good, happy lives, we might think, without having much of an opinion on whether that good life is one that's explained in terms of desire satisfaction theory or hedonism. Some people might be able to succeed in living a good life rather unreflectively, but that's perhaps an arguable philosophical claim that itself. Socrates himself claimed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Well, that's within the umbrella of theorizing about well-being, right? So these theories of well-being are trying to specify what's intrinsically good for us. We'll get into what we're talking about when we talk about intrinsic goods in just a moment. We'll remember that at the outset of this course, we made a distinction between meta-ethics, normative ethics, and value theory. Remember, meta-ethics is a theory about the status of morality, that is, whether it's objective or subjective or intersubjective. It also asks questions about how we can gain moral knowledge and what we're talking about when we talk about morality, right? Theories of normative ethics tell us what to do, right? So it gives us a theory of what the difference between a right action and a wrong action is. So Kantianism and utilitarianism and virtue ethics are examples of theory of normative ethics, as well as specific claims about what you should be doing to live a good life. So Peter Singer's claim that you ought to be giving lots and lots of money to charities like Oxfam and Against Malaria Foundation, the Against Malaria Foundation. Those are also claims in normative ethics. And then there's value theory. Value theory is the theory about what makes a life go well and what makes it go less badly. So which category do theories of well-being fall into? Well, pretty straightforwardly, the answer is value theory. Because value theories about inquiry into the good life and what's valuable for its own sake. Talk about what's valuable for its own sake. As we'll see, that's just another way of talking about what's intrinsically good for us. So here's how Shafer-Landau makes the distinction. He says that something is instrumentally valuable if it is valuable because of the goods it brings about. So the examples that Shafer-Landau gives us are chocolate, sturdy shoes, vaccinations, and money, right? So it's a good thing to have money because the more of it you have, the more choices you can make. It gives you the option of ordering takeout tonight, or it gives you more ways of, accessing transport, whether that be by car or by plane or hiring a taxi, right? Vaccinations are good because they prevent you from getting diseases with very little risk, right? So the idea is instrumentally valuable things are good because they help you get something else. Now we might think that, well, if a college degree is good for a job, and a job is good because it gets you money, and money is good because it gets you sturdy shoes, and sturdy shoes are good because it gets you bodily health. We say that something is intrinsically valuable if it's valuable for its own sake, right? So the idea is that the things that are instrumentally valuable are the things that help us get sort of like the stopping point in what we value. So we say, like, I value sturdy shoes because that helps me have good posture, and good posture helps me be healthy. If I asked you, well, why do you want to be healthy? You might stop at that point and say, well, health is just a good thing to have for its own sake. I will say, I thought it was kind of weird that Shafer-Landau put chocolate on the list of instrumental goods. I think a lot of people will tell you having chocolate is a thing that we pursue for its own sake. It's not something like money or a college degree. We say it's worth having for precisely what it is in itself, not in the things that it gets you, like vaccinations, which is health. But the point here is remember that we're thinking about intrinsically valuable things, things that are worth getting for their own sake. And that's what we're ultimately interested in specifying when we give a theory of the good life. What is valuable for its own sake? So the first theory that we're going to look at is hedonism. And hedonism states that pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically good for people, and that pain is the only thing that's intrinsically bad for people. So in fact, if you're a hedonist, Shafer-Landau's claim that chocolate is instrumentally good is now understandable, right? Why do we value chocolate? Well, it's because when we eat chocolate, it brings us pleasure. It brings us happiness. So the hedonist says, look, the only thing that's intrinsically good, the only thing worth having for its own sake, is pleasure. So even if we say health, well, why is health a good thing to have? Well, the healthier you are, the less you end up suffering. And then hedonism also states pain is the only thing that's intrinsically bad for people. So that's what you think if you're a hedonist. Now, there's something that you've got to watch out for. One question might be, well, I thought that hedonism is about, going kind of crazy, like partying hard. It's like enjoying things like sex or drugs or alcohol or loud music. And that's what you might be thinking of when you think about hedonism. Now, that's not necessarily what every hedonist is going to do. Not every hedonist is going to say, well, pain is the only bad thing, pleasure is the only good thing, so I'm going to pursue a life of sex, drugs, song, and so forth. So one of the most famous early hedonists was a guy named Epicurus. And Epicurus realized that, well, pleasures are pretty transitory and pains are really things that you ought to manage. And he thought that the way to live the most pleasant life you could was, in fact, to live an extremely moderate life, to have calm emotions, to not eat too crazy a diet. So a lot of like rice and vegetables and not too much else is what Epicurus thought would be, the most pleasant life, would be a calm one. So not all hedonism is crazy partying. Some of it might be sort of like smart, calm, measured pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. So what are some benefits of hedonist theories? Well, Shafer-Landau points out that the hedonist can account for the idea that there are many different kinds of good life, right? So it might be that, some people like listening to classical music, some people like listening to jazz, and some people like listening to loud rock bands. Well, the hedonist can explain this. They can say, well, it depends on what brings you pleasure, right? So there's many ways of getting pleasure, so there's many kinds of good life. So it's inclusive in that way. What makes me happy might not make you happy. And there's a certain amount of personal authority concerning well-being, right? If I know that I like listening to jazz music and rock music more than classical music, then that sort of settles the question about what's going to enhance my life. And there's a certain kind of intuitive plausibility to hedonist theories. Misery is clearly bad for us, and happiness clearly improves our lives. And hedonists can account for that by pointing out, well, that's exactly what our theory says. Pleasure is the only good thing, pain is the only bad thing, and the fact that these are the most obviously bad and good things is because of the fact that these are really what it's all about. So they can justify many different rules of what it is to live a good life. So make good friends. Why should you make good friends? Because when you have good friends, that'll bring you happiness and pleasure. Get an interesting job. Again, that will bring you happiness and pleasure, right? Get enough sleep. Try to exercise. Maybe try meditating. These are all things that can be explained according to the hedonist theory. The hedonist can also explain the exceptions to these rules of the good life. So one rule might be, don't spend time with people who humiliate you. But if you're a masochist, a masochist is a person who takes pleasure in being harmed or humiliated. Well, if you're a masochist, then you are an exception to the rule that you should avoid being around people who humiliate you. You might get a certain kind of kick or pleasure out of that. And if you do, then, well, the hedonist is going to say, well, if you get enough pleasure out of that strategy in your life, then go for it. It's going to make you better off, after all. So this is the basic outlook of the hedonist. Basically, how well things are going for you is a direct function of how much pleasure and how little pain you have in your life. Okay, so now that we have a picture of hedonism, try to maximize the amount of pleasure that you have in your life over pain, we're going to look at three arguments. Here's the first argument. It's the argument from evil pleasures. So this theory says, if hedonism is true, then happiness that comes from evil deeds is as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. So the idea here would be, well, if I get pleasure from, I'm trying to think of an evil deed that a person could get pleasure from. Watching people trip on the sidewalk, right? Watching people suffer, right? And you, on the other hand, get pleasure not from watching people trip and fall, but you get pleasure from, helping old ladies in need cross the street. Well, the hedonist says, the pleasure in my life adds just as much to my life as your pleasure that you get from doing the right thing adds to yours. But then the argument continues, happiness that comes from evil deeds is not as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. So therefore, hedonism is false. Right? If hedonism were true, then both kinds of happiness would count the same. But premise 2 says they don't. Therefore, hedonism is false. Now, you might wonder about this argument. What should the hedonist say in reply? Well, here's one way of going. And I think that Shafer-Landau was right in suggesting that this argument, unless we think it through some more, has something kind of wrong with it. Now, premise 1 just falls out of the definition of hedonism, right? Premise 2, though, is making the claim that one kind of happiness is less good than another kind of happiness. But when we're giving a theory of well-being, we're not talking about which forms of well-being are more good or worse. We're just talking about how well a life is going. And when we're talking about how well a life is going, and if you're a hedonist, you're going to say, well, how well your life is going just depends on how much pleasure you're having. And insofar as we might think that, yeah, it's a bad thing for evil people to be successful or overly happy, we realize that it is possible to do something evil and be well off, right? So the idea is that, like if Dr. Evil, blows up the moon with his giant laser, if it's the case that that brings him pleasure, things are going well for Dr. Evil, even though he did a bad thing, right? So the idea here is that this is happiness coming from evil deeds, and it's still happiness nonetheless. So that's why this version of the argument we might think is unsuccessful. Let's look at another one. This is the argument from false happiness. Premise 1, really, again, this just falls out of the definition of hedonism. If it's true, then our lives go well to the extent that we are happy. But 2, it's not the case that our lives go well to the extent that we're happy. Those whose happiness is based on false beliefs have worse lives than people whose happiness is based on true beliefs, even if both lives are equally happy. Therefore, hedonism is false. So premise 1 just falls out of the definition, so it's about, really, whether premise 2 is true. So let's try to think up some examples here. One example, this is the one that Shafer-Landau gives you in the textbook. You can imagine 2 women, both of who are happy in the marriages that they're in. And one of them, unbeknownst to her, has a spouse that cheats on her. Now, the thought is that if you have a spouse that's cheating on you, but the only reason you're happy is that you don't know about it, the thought would be that you are, in fact, worse off. So, if that's right, then there's more to doing well than simply being happy, right? Because we could have somebody who's happy, but who has many false beliefs, right? And not only do you have false beliefs, but the happiness is based on those false beliefs, right? Now, you never find out that your happiness is based on false beliefs, but even if you never find out, premise 2 suggests that you're doing worse so long as your happiness is based on false beliefs. Here's another example. You might know the Jim Carrey movie from the 90s, The Truman Show. So if you haven't seen the movie, the basic idea of the movie is that Truman lives this extremely happy life. He has a good job, a good bunch of neighbors. He's got a best friend. His wife is good to him. But what he doesn't know is that all of reality is an illusion, and that since birth he's been basically raised up to be in a reality show. Basically, he has his own television network and people watch Truman's life as it goes along. Now, the idea is that before he finds out anything is wrong, Truman is happy. But he's not doing as well as we might think of some hypothetical Truman who lives a qualitatively similar life, but which is not based on a lie. We can imagine one other version of this argument. In fact, this is something worth typing in. We might also consider Robert Nozick and his thought experiment, which is the experience machine. Now, Nozick's idea is that when you're plugged into the experience machine, okay, sorry for that little cut in our audio there. I just had to attend to something. So yeah, Robert Nozick's thought experiment says, imagine a machine, you plug yourself into it, and you start having all of these wonderful experiences. You imagine having good friends. You imagine achieving lots of really important things, maybe like writing a great novel. But it turns out that everything that you achieve and everything that you experience is really an illusion. Now, you don't know this. So you're getting a whole lot of pleasure from these friendships and achievements that you're experiencing. Now, Nozick's point is that in the experience machine, you aren't actually doing these things, and you're worse off as a result. Well, this is just another elaboration of this argument from false happiness, right? It's the idea that if your happiness is based on false beliefs, then you're not really doing all that well. And if that's right, then hedonism can't be true. Let's look at one more argument against hedonism. It says that if hedonism is true, then autonomy contributes to a good life only insofar as it makes us happy, right? Because for hedonism, happiness is the only intrinsic good, and happiness is the only intrinsic good, and everything else is instrumentally good. 2, autonomy sometimes directly contributes to a good life, even when it fails to make us happy. So we might think that it's a bad thing and we're made worse off when people interfere with our autonomy, even if it, causes us to avoid making sometimes painful mistakes. And if that's right, then hedonism is false. So if you think that freedom or autonomy are things that are worth having, even when we get less happiness, we might have a really strong reason, or you will have a really strong reason, if you believe that you can be made worse off by having your autonomy violated, even in the name of happiness. Well, if you believe that, then you can't be a hedonist. Because the hedonist is going to think, well, violations of autonomy are perfectly acceptable so long as happiness is being promoted. So that's it for part 1 today. And we're going to pick up in just a moment with desire satisfaction theory. So thanks for listening in so far, and we'll have another video coming right up.